Hello, welcome to Chapter 3 in Introduction to Sociology, where we will be discussing social class and social stratification. So first we want to go over some definitions that you need to know for the class. Social differentiation is the process by which different statuses develop in any group, organization, or society. So in terms of what we see here is that, for example, in high school, football players tend to have more status than chess club, and so on. Social class is the social position a group holds relative to the economic, social, political, and cultural resources of society. Class determines how much access these groups have to these resources. And when we think of social class, we think of upper class, middle class, working class, and the lower classes. So we'll be discussing this in a lot more detail in this particular slideshow. First, a little history. So let's look at social stratification throughout the last 1,000 years or so. We have the estate system, which is ownership of property and the exercise of power are monopolized by an elite class who have total control over societal resources. And for example, we saw in the Middle Ages the feudal system when the nobility owned the land and the peasants worked the land in exchange for housing and food. So in this context, the people who are working the land are essentially slaves. They get fed and they get somewhere to live, but that's it. They're not making any cash money. Then we move into the caste system, which is still pretty relevant in certain parts of the world today. This is where status is bestowed on a person by circumstances of their birth. So, for example, in South Africa, prior to the end of apartheid in the late 1980s, early 90s, black people were considered second-class citizens and their rights were severely restricted. This is when the black population in South Africa made up over 90% of the population, and the whites, who came essentially from Great Britain when they colonized South Africa, were about 10% of the population, but they owned everything. And, these signs that were everywhere. So, India had a caste system until the end of the 1940s. Gandhi tried to get rid of it. And the lowest class, the untouchables, were the ones who worked in the sewers, they cleaned the streets, basically all the really dirty jobs. It was thought that touching an untouchable would pollute a person. So, despite the fact that this has been eradicated since the late 1940s, it's still pretty prevalent, especially in areas of India where you don't see a lot of modernity. Then we have class systems, which is what we have in the United States. A person's status in society is achieved through the acquisition of resources and power. In the United States, the lack of access to education, healthcare, social resources are oftentimes limits a person's ability to achieve status. Max Weber called this access to resources life chances. These are the opportunities that are available to a person born into socioeconomic classes. So when we look at this kind of system, what we're seeing is there are haves and there are have-nots. The U.S. is an example of class inequality. Some people have enormous access to good schools, big houses, healthcare, and other resources, while others in this country have very little access to any of these things. And especially in the last 15 years, what we've seen is the rich are getting richer, the middle class are falling underwater, and the poor are basically being left to drown. So who has what? 1% of the U.S. population controls over a third of the total wealth in this country. 50% of the U.S. population controls 1% of the total wealth in this country. So what these two numbers are essentially saying is that the very rich have a lot of wealth and a lot of money, whereas the vast majority of people in this country have little or no money. A U.S. worker who makes minimum wage and works full-time, i.e. 40 hours a week, will make approximately $15,000 a year. And as you will see when we move further along in this, $15,000 a year is essentially below the poverty level depending on how many kids you have. So, speaking of children, let's see how the children are doing in the United States. 22% of U.S. children live in poverty. 39% are African American, 34% are Hispanic, 13.5% are Asian American, and 1.5% are Caucasian. Now, what you'll see here with this chart is that the lighter the color, the better off the state is. And what you'll notice is that there are certain states that are dark blue or kind of a medium blue where the poverty rate is just unbelievably high for young people. You know, it's basically the Mason-Dixon line kind of identifies what we're talking about here. So, you know, what you see is that these states in the South and the Southwest are struggling to raise their children because the poverty levels are so significant. So what is poverty level? And this is the 2014 poverty guidelines for the 48 contiguous states in the District of Columbia. And you'll see here's our 15,000. So if you have 2 people in your household and you make 15,730 or less, you live in poverty. The reality for a lot of people is that if you don't have a college education and you don't have a lot of opportunities to get a potentially good job, there is a very good chance that you will live in poverty, because without skills and without some measure of ability to move up in the world of work, you're stuck working minimum wage jobs. Material possessions are often the best way of identifying a person's class. So they can include clothing, jewelry, cars. So, you know, you see a lot of people who wear labels. You see a lot of cars that have that BMW or Mercedes or Tesla mark on them. And that really is representing a certain lifestyle that people want everyone to think they have. These ostentatious displays of material possessions are called conspicuous consumption. People purposefully display their labels or brands to define their status. So let's define socioeconomic status. It is derived from 3 elements. You have income, occupational prestige, which is the value people place on your job. So for example, if you tell people you are a plumber or an electrician, you may not have the same occupational prestige as someone who is a doctor or a lawyer. Even though both of those kinds of jobs can bring in a lot of income. But people see doctors and lawyers as having a higher occupational prestige. And then education. And in general, the more education one has, the higher their status. So when someone has a PhD, they're perceived as a much more important person than somebody who has a high school diploma. Economic inequality. So let's talk about some of the numbers. Income is the amount of money brought into the household from various sources. So your income, most of us come from wages that we get from work. Some of us may have some investments, so we get investment income. We may have stocks and bonds and we get dividends. In the last few years, though, the only people who have seen an increase in income are the people who are at the top of the economic pyramid, the most wealthy. And you'll see here this chart. So in 1979, the average household income for someone who was in the top 1% was about $500,000. In 2007, it was just under $2 million. So they have seen a tremendous increase in wages over the last 30 years. Now, look at everybody else. Pretty much flat all the way through. And this is the issue that a lot of people in this country are very unhappy about, is that the laws and the bills that get passed in this country seem to benefit the very wealthy and no one else. Everyone else has either seen their incomes go down or stay the same because of the way that the politicians have worked the system. And if you don't believe that, you will see later on that these same people have affected the political process in a significant way. So let's talk about wealth, or net worth, is the monetary value of everything you own. So think of all your financial assets, your house, your car, your 401k, if you have any of this stuff, minus what you owe. So if you have a mortgage on your house, if you have a credit card, if you have a note on your car, all of those are your debts. Net worth or wealth can be passed on to the next generation, often giving the next generation a head start on financial security. So if mom or dad goes to the great mom or dad place in the sky, they will leave you what they have. Now, in some families, you may get a lot of money, and in other families, you end up having to come up with money to bury them because they had nothing. To put this in context, 20% of the U.S. population has zero or negative net worth, meaning debts exceed their assets. So 1 in 5 people in this country have nothing. The median net worth by race in the United States: Caucasian, $110,000, African American, just under $5,000, and Hispanic, just over $7,000. That is a disparity that is pretty shocking. And part of that comes from the idea that when wealth is handed down, and if grandma and grandpa were poor and they didn't leave anything for mom and dad are starting at scratch. Whereas if you come from a middle-class family and mom and dad left you $100,000 or $200,000, then that kind of scenario comes through where you start off way ahead of somebody who starts at zero. The connection between politics and wealth. Those with the most wealth also tend to be the ones with the most political clout, since they can donate money to politicians who they support and who agree with their political positions. This in turn means that politicians who get elected are the ones who are working to keep the status quo for wealthy individuals. Just this year, a decision by the Supreme Court held that essentially corporations are people and they can donate as much money as they want to a political campaign. So, you and I have a few bucks sitting in our bank account, but a company like Apple or a company like ExxonMobil has billions of dollars sitting in their bank account. So they have a lot more money to throw around. And as such, politicians who want to get elected to office are going to need these big money donors and not the little guys like you and I. Another issue are the structural economic issues which cause inequality. Until the 1980s, manufacturing was a relatively stable industry, and many people who lacked a college education could get a good job at a middle-class wage and decent benefits. So what you see here is this is what Detroit was looking like back before the 1980s. It was an extremely busy city, very big city, and it was the car capital of the United States. Well, in the 1990s, the decision was made to send a lot of the manufacturing jobs for automotive parts and automobiles to Mexico. And as a consequence, what you see now is Detroit is a city that has literally fallen apart. It has become much, much smaller. They're knocking down buildings around the main city part because there's so much that's been abandoned. When manufacturing declined in the 1990s because of the rise of technology and globalization, the U.S. economy became a service economy. So during the 90s, what you saw was automotive manufacturing going down to Mexico. And again, what you see here is 1985, we had less than 500,000 cars made in Mexico. By 2010, 2011, now we're looking at almost 3 million cars being made in Mexico. Additionally, what you also saw was the fact that China became an emerging market, which allowed U.S. companies to move their manufacturing plants to China, where they would pay significantly less for these manufactured goods. You know, companies like Nike became very integrated into the Chinese economy because they sent all their manufacturing over there. So instead of paying somebody $30,000 a year in the United States, they could pay somebody in China $3,000 a year, which of course, as a company that's out to make a profit, that's something that they're going to want to do. This resulted in many people losing their jobs and ending up in minimum wage service jobs because the manufacturing jobs were sent overseas. So somebody who was making $20 or $22 an hour in a car factory in Detroit, when they lost their job, oftentimes had no way of making that kind of money in any other job. So they ended up working at a place like Walmart or working in fast food where they're making minimum wage. And as a consequence to that, a lot of people started to lose that status of being middle class. Another example is how tax is applied to different kinds of income. So wages and salaries are taxed at a much higher rate than capital gains. Now, what is a capital gains? A capital gains is income from investments like stocks and bonds. And people who rake in a lot of capital gains tend to be very wealthy, whereas most of us, especially those of us in the working classes and the middle classes, tend to work for a salary. And you can see over here, these are the 2010 rates for married taxpayers filing jointly from the IRS. Income rates. So, if you make less than $17,000 a year, you are taxed at a rate of 10%. If you make under 68 but more than 16,750, 15%. 68 to 137, 25%. 137,000 to 209, 28%, and so on and so forth. Now notice the capital gains tax rates. If you make $68,000 in dividends or interest, you pay no tax. And when you get above 68, you're only paying 15%. So if you come from a wealthy family and you're heavily invested in the stock market, there's an excellent possibility that you will not make anywhere near the same kind of tax payments that somebody in the middle class who works for a living has to make. And that is something that really gets people upset. So what is the middle class? According to a 2012 report, the median household income in the U.S. is approximately $50,000. In general, a family earning this amount is considered middle class. What you'll see here, and this is from California. California is the 6th largest economy in the world. So California really is a good representation of the United States overall. So what you'll see is that the middle class families have gone from almost 61% of the population to less than 50%. you'll also see that low-income families have grown, so 34% to 37%. And high-income families have also grown in that sense that the rich are getting richer, so 5.5% to 13.7%. Class conflict is derived from conflict theory and Karl Marx's writings about capitalism. And what he says is that inequality is a result of the unequal distribution of power and resources in society. The super rich exploit and dominate the people on the bottom of the economic food chain. Now let me give you an example of what we're talking about here. You don't have a college education, you don't have any specific skills, so you end up working at Walmart for $7.25 an hour. You work 40 hours a week and you make $15,000 a year. Once your taxes are taken out and your Social Security is taken out and your state taxes are taken out, that leaves you with about $12,000 a year. Now, that $12,000 a year is supposed to pay your housing, your groceries, heating, cable, phone, all of your regular bills. And anyone who has ever had to pay their own bills will tell you that's not going to go very far. So what we see is that a vast number of people who work for Walmart are receiving benefits such as free health care and food stamps. So you have all of these people who work full-time jobs who cannot afford to keep themselves, so they receive all these benefits from the government. Now, why won't Walmart pay more money? Well, because then their profits will go down, and they don't want to do that. So the government steps in and provides this welfare for people who work for this incredibly wealthy company, keeping in mind that 3 out of the 10 richest people in this country are all affiliated with Walmart. Karl Marx predicted that capitalism would result in only 2 social classes: the capitalists, i.e. the super rich or Mr. Burns, and the proletariat, which is everyone else. And unfortunately, the United States democracy has really gone in this direction, because as the Supreme Court makes more and more decisions that say that people can donate as much money as they want to political campaigns, that means the politicians cater more and more to those people who have the big money. So let's talk about some differentiations here. Your class designation gives you specific access to jobs, income, education, power, and social status. So, for example, if your mom and dad are super wealthy and you're not a very good student, you can still go to Harvard or Yale because your parents just have to make a large donation on your behalf. On the other hand, somebody who is poor and has, perfect grades and has a terrific SAT score may not get into Harvard or Yale because their parents don't have a huge amount of money to pay for their academic schooling, and they may end up going to a state university which their parents might be able to afford with student loans, keeping in mind that a college like Princeton or Harvard can cost $40,000 or $50,000 a year. In terms of social categories and how people are separated, the most important tend to be gender, race, class, and age. So let's talk about some gender issues. In 2011, the average income for men was $48,000, and the average income for women was $37,000, which is 77% of men's income. Now, this is a very macro-analytic perspective, because all they're looking at is the average income. They're not looking at how much somebody who's a male doctor makes versus someone who's a female doctor. They're just looking at the overall population. And one of the elements that contributes to this situation is that women tend to work in gender segregated jobs more often than men do. So what you see is women tend to be school teachers, women tend to be nurses, women tend to go into childcare, and as a consequence those jobs become devalued and they don't pay as well. And if you ask any nurse, they will tell you that they work harder or as hard as any doctor. And whether or not, that's true, the point is that a doctor will make well into, $200,000, $300,000, whereas a nurse oftentimes maxes out at around $80,000 or $90,000, which is still great money, by the way. 15% of the American population live in poverty, and that's about 46 million people. Poverty rates declined in the U.S. from the 1950s to the 2000s, but around 2000 the poverty rate began to increase again. And this is again when we start to see the decline in manufacturing, changes in political donation laws, which change the way people are treated by the government. The majority of people in this country are white, but because the majority of the people in the U.S. are white. The next chart will explain this in a lot more detail. So what we're looking here is the proportionate numbers. So our U.S. population is about 316 million, and that changes about every minute because, as people live, born, die, things change. So this number, just keep in mind, is a rough estimate. So percentage of the population. Whites are 63%, African American 13%, Hispanic 17%, Native American is 1% of the population, and Asians are 5%. These numbers come from the 2010 census. So when we take this number, 63%, so when you multiply this number, the 316 million, by the percentage of the population, you get the population numbers. So then we look at the level of poverty. So white people, their poverty level is about 9%, which means there's 18 million people who are white living in poverty. But look at these other numbers. African Americans, Hispanics, and Native Americans are all over 25% in terms of their level of poverty. So what that means is that 1 out of every 4 Hispanics living in the United States live in poverty. For African Americans, it's even worse. It's 1 in 3.5, and same with the Native Americans. These numbers are just astronomical in terms of the percentages of the population. So when you see that, you can see that the level of poverty really does dictate a much more significant number than the idea of overall, because it really is skewed more towards the minorities, because the white people, who are the dominant culture, tend to make laws that benefit them. So let's look at the geography of poverty. Poverty rates are highest in the South, the Southwest, and some parts of the Midwest. The 5 poorest states in the United States, based on the percentage of people living below the poverty line. Mississippi is number 1, Arkansas, West Virginia, Alabama, and Kentucky. And the irony is that these states tend to elect people to their Congress and the Senate that are doing the work not of the poor, but are beholden to the very wealthy companies. And as such, there's not a lot being done for the people living in these states to help them out of their lifestyle. Another issue is called the feminization of poverty. And this is a large proportion of the poor are women and children. 34% of women who are head of household live below the poverty line. That, again, a huge number, a third. And again, what you see are these numbers where, again, you see the more likely you are to be a minority, the more likely you are to live in poverty. And this trend has come about for several reasons. Number 1, dramatic growth of single-parent households, usually led by women. Single women with children tend to have poor job prospects and don't earn much. Lack of child support payments to moms. Wage inequality, and women tend to live longer than men, and they have to make do with retirement funds that are left after their husband dies. So there's a lot of issues that are related to this particular trend, but the big one seems to oftentimes be that women become the primary caretakers of their children. Now, that's not 100% of the time. There are single fathers. However, the vast majority of single-parent households are led by women. And when the dads don't provide child support or don't provide any kind of support for the mom who's trying to work, then you end up with these poverty levels. So who actually supports the poor? The middle and working classes shoulder much of the responsibility for taxes. These taxes fund social programs which produces resentment by these groups towards the poor. So what you're seeing here, and this is a 2010 federal revenues, this is from the Office of Management, that is part of the government. Payroll taxes and individual income taxes account for the vast majority. Corporate income taxes, 9%. So what you see here is that the middle class and the working class people out there are the ones who are really supporting the poor, not the very rich. Now, a lot of people will say, well, you know, the poor get welfare and they get food stamps and they don't have to work and they get and sit home and they drive Cadillacs. And the fact of the matter is that is just not true. These groups like to point to the lazy, shiftless welfare cheats. The vast majority of people, though, in the U.S. are not on welfare. 30 years ago, Ronald Reagan came out with the story of the welfare mom who had children every year so she could stay on welfare, and she drove a caddy, and she lived in a huge house, and she was collecting all this money. Well, the story was just not true, and it's been debunked. But a good story lasts a long time, and people love the story. So a lot of people still believe this, but the reality is that a person can go on welfare for 5 years total over their lifetime. And after 2 years on welfare, the person must either find a job or do community service. When all is said and done, only 4 million people in the U.S. are on welfare, so only about 1% of the population, keeping in mind that 46% of the population in this country live below the poverty line. More significantly is the fact that 15% of the U.S. population receives food stamps. So the vast majority of poor people do in fact receive food stamps, but they average about $133 per month. And if you've ever gone to the grocery store and you have kids, you know they can eat $133 worth of food in about 4 days. So, you know, we're not talking about people who are living in the lap of luxury when they are on food stamps. So that will finish Chapter 8. If you have any questions, please send me an email or a text message, and I hope you have a fantastic day. Thank you.